All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we look at great theories of everything, ancient and modern, and in particular, very obscure things that you've never heard of before. But if you had, or if you do, then they could transform your life in terms of helping you out with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your creation of a holistic worldview, and really your overall spiritual, mental, and physical health. And today is our 19th video that we've done on Daniel Ingram's book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And this book is mainly about Buddhist meditation and practice, and coming from the horse's mouth. Ingram has spent a lot of time over in monasteries in Southeast Asia, and brings back many treasures that otherwise you would not have access to because you don't speak the language. And assuming you don't speak the language, I don't speak the language. And but he has really, I think, encapsulated these ideas and has put them into English. So I think that's a rare opportunity. We are in a chapter where he's talking about teachers, and we left off right here, so we'll just start up with reading from this juncture on the section on teachers. It is easy to imagine that just because they are ethically impeccable, that they have some understanding of deep wisdom. And conversely, it is easy to imagine that just because they have some deep wisdom, that they will be moral. As the ongoing pragmatic Dharma experiment has shown in spades, it is easier to develop strong concentration and insight than it is to develop strong morality, or simply basic kindness for that matter. There are those who have a strong degree of mastery of all three, and those are people to seek out and learn from whenever possible. Beware assuming that those who know ultimate reality to whatever degree can't have unskillful relationships to money, power, drugs, and sex. Call me a prude, a traditionalist, or whatever, and not to presume to tell anyone else how to live their life. But I assert that, in general, it is best to avoid having sex with your Dharma teachers. This goes doubly if secrecy is demanded, or if you are involving yourself with someone who publicly claims celibacy or is in another closed relationship. Following this simple advice will save you and them, and many others, all kinds of serious trouble. There are many people out there to have sex with. Those who claim that this is to benefit you, or that it will lead to special wisdom, are just selling something. It's easy to avoid this trap if you learn a bit about your own investment in being or feeling special, which often touches on difficult to identify and significant psychological wounding. You have been warned. I was once at a Buddhist geeks conference in which we discussed the fact of the wide range of relationships that some teachers have to sexuality, language, substances, and other similarly adult subjects. Someone made the very interesting and perhaps reasonable proposal that teachers should be rated as movies are in the American film rating system and expected to adhere to their rating, so that people can at least know what they might be getting themselves into. Teachers rating something like an R should have additional labels that explain why they get that rating, such as drugs, sex, language, etc. In this system, rated G teachers should not be expected to act like rated XXX teachers, for example. However, were a rated XXX teacher to behave like the rated XXX teacher they are, that could hardly be cause for alarm or scandal or accusations of hypocrisy. While we could debate the pros and cons of such a system, it is more reasonable than what currently happens, which is that nearly all teachers are assumed to be G or PG at most, whereas some reasonable number are way past PG-13 in practice. I personally would likely get a PG-13 due to the language that I routinely use. When we interact with teachers, we may wish to consider which of their areas of expertise we wish to draw from. That is, which of the 3 trainings we want help with. In fact, again, the 3 trainings are training in morality, training in concentration, and training in insight or wisdom. Okay, in fact, I think it's very important to be clear about this from the outset, so that when we go into talk with a teacher, we can ask questions from the correct conceptual framework and fit their advice back into the correct framework. If we ask a teacher about how to attain some high state and they mention tuning into boundless joy during meditation, and then we try to do this when driving to work and crash into the rear of the car of the poor commuter in front of us, we have not followed their advice properly or skillfully. Similarly, we may wish to explicitly ask our teachers if they are skilled in the aspect of the specific training we are interested in mastering, and to what level. Obviously, not all will be honest when answering this question for various reasons. If they say something like, "No, I don't know enough to speak on that level as my own abilities are not that strong yet," then at least you know to seek advice elsewhere, unless, of course, they are lying to you. I have much more respect for a teacher who once told me that he didn't feel qualified to teach me than for the numerous teachers who were not qualified to teach me, who either didn't realize this or tried to pretend otherwise. It is also definitely true that some teachers are loath to speak about their specific attainments and skill sets, which can make things much more confusing for those trying to figure out who knows what. Regardless of whether this is motivated by humility, vows, cultural conditioning, or some other reason, it still makes things confusing for those who are trying to follow a pragmatic approach and who are used to straightforward communication. There are also obviously deceptive teachers who artificially inflate their abilities through overt boasting, as well as those who take the opposite approach, using gestures of humility that are intended to create an impression of great knowledge. Would that all this were easy. I would recommend making your goals for your life and practice specific. For instance, you may wish to get a job as a dishwasher so that you can continue to feed yourself as you prioritize your practice. You go to the meditation teacher and say, "I want to get a job as a dishwasher. Do you know how to do this?" They may say, "Yeah, sure." To which you could reply, "How do you do this?" They could just as easily have said, "I am sorry, I can't help you there. I'm a meditation teacher, not a career counselor or restaurant manager." The same basic conversational pattern could be repeated just as easily for the other 2 trainings. For instance, you could ask a meditation teacher, "I wish to learn how to get into the early concentration states. Do you know how to do this?" You could also ask, "I wish to attain to the first stage of enlightenment. Do you know how to do this?" If they say yes, the next question would be, "Would you be willing to guide me in those steps, please?" This sort of straightforward approach to spirituality is extremely practical, grounded, and empowering. Further, it makes interactions with teachers more fruitful. However, there are teachers who can still teach you useful things that won't respond well to those sorts of direct questions. And here we find the murky territory for which I have no great ability to provide guidance except to say, keep your wits about you. Be respectful, ask reasonable questions of those in the community about the quality of the teacher and the actual results that students have when they study with them, and pay attention. Traditional monastics will almost never discuss their practice directly, though some will give hints, some of which are glaring, and the talk and gossip around monasteries will often involve guesses and rumors about who knows what. Teachers can generally tell if you are serious and if you have clearly thought through what you want. For instance, it takes about 10 seconds of someone asking a meditation teacher for advice on their emotional stuff for the teacher to realize that this person is interested in working on conventional happiness, that is, psychological or emotional well-being, and not in learning or doing insight practices. There is nothing wrong with working on emotional well-being, and you certainly need a baseline of it to be able to progress in meditation practice. But if it's your priority, you may need to first focus on strengthening your training in morality before embarking on insight practices. Similarly, it takes few conversations with a student to figure out if they are following your advice or not. So don't think you can fool them. If you don't like their advice, better to tell them that and explain why, so that they can address the issue either by modifying their advice or by further explaining why they feel their advice might be helpful. Further, if you follow some of their advice but change parts or select parts and add other things, cutting and pasting to suit your preferences, and then find that this way of working has not produced the desired results, be careful about criticizing the teacher or the method, as you have not performed the experiment as recommended. If someone told you, for example, to stabilize your attention on the individual sensations that make up the experience of breathing so clearly that you could see the beginning and ending of every single sensation consistently for an hour, and instead you ricochet back and forth from the breath to other mental and physical sensations, or stop the practice before you apply the exact instruction given, don't blame them if you do not get the promised results. Barring insurmountable external circumstances, the choice not to do the work is clearly yours, and thus you should accept personal responsibility for your own failure. I'm not trying to be harsh, only honest and realistic. I am obviously a firm believer that people should take responsibility for what happens in their lives and practices. Not doing so is tantamount to you selecting to disempower yourself. Tangentially, but important to point out, teachers are wherever they are on their own path, dealing with their own lives, coming at things from their own conditioning, and filtering their perception of reality through wherever they find themselves in their own practice, just as everyone else is. There are cycles in our bodies, our lives, and our practices that can significantly color how we see things. And that applies to meditation teachers as much, or perhaps at times even more, so than everyone else, as strong practice can produce some strong side effects. So, if you have some odd interaction with someone in a teacher role, it might be that they just got some really bad news about their sibling being sick, or are coming down with a stomach bug, or started having bad menstrual cramps when they were scheduled to have their interview with you. Or maybe you remind them of their ex who they just broke up with. Something in your own practice, your face, your story, your way of speaking, or whatever, might contain some psychological triggers specific to them and their conditioning. Just as you want understanding from others dealing with you, grant that to others and be mindful of how their being in a position of authority may short-circuit your own capacity for empathy. Their own practice might be in a strange or difficult place, and they might not be able to fully control the bleed-through from that. So if something seems off in an interview or interaction, consider gently asking what is going on. They might not tell you, and they might not even know or be able to identify the reason for the difficulty at that moment, or ever. It might be that that's the way they are, but at least considering the issue shows that you have enough of a meta perspective to come up with a broader assessment of what is happening at that moment, rather than personalizing it and backsliding to reactivity. However, it is also possible that something about that interaction is in fact personal in relative terms, meaning that the reaction is about you and your way of being in that interaction. What personal, meditative, psychological, or other things were going on that influenced each part of this book as I wrote it? I am certain I couldn't tell you everything that influenced the tone and presentation of each part, and in person, real time, my assessment would probably be just as inaccurate and incomplete. In a similar vein, those in teaching roles may personally be doing very different practices from the ones they are teaching you, and coming from a perspective that has been transformed into something very different from the one you are coming to practice with. Something people can be in places and doing practices that are very different from the ones they started with or are known for, such as in a book or a talk from their past. For example, the last time I did formal noting was probably sometime in 2001 or so, and that would have been only briefly, and the last time I practiced noting a lot was in 1996 or so. If a teacher has a profoundly transformed perception of reality and has been this way long enough, it can be difficult to relate to those who are facing the problems and issues that arise in an earlier phase of practice. In fact, it seems to be relatively common for people far along the path to start teaching a way of practicing that makes sense if you are as far along the path as they are, but might not be anything like the practices they did to get to the point where that way of teaching and those practices and perspectives make sense or can be well integrated. Because of this, the teacher's current practice or take on things might not make much or any sense for where you currently are. Whereas, were that teacher to teach you the basics and the techniques that got him or her their early breaks, practices they may not have done in years or decades, then you might do much better. The specific form of this that I find most unfortunate and dangerous is the teacher who spent years doing a strict practice under a particular teacher or tradition, requiring a specific technique, discipline, study, and hard cushion hours, who then, on the basis of that practice, gains some degree of insight, has some form of awakening experience, and then disavows the teacher or tradition they trained under because they themselves no longer feel they need it, having gained some of the promised realizations and insights. They denied crediting the rigorous path they followed with their current realization, tell their followers this, and of course, those followers do nothing, apply no discipline, technique, or effort, and predictably get nowhere, but are nevertheless wowed by the snippets of real, hard-won, practice-derived insight the teacher does offer them in talks and question and answer sessions. In fact, I can think of numerous contemporary examples of teachers who teach perspectives and techniques that ironically in no way resemble what helped them arrive at their own realizations. It's an unfortunate, if unconscious, form of deception that and undermines the precious real estate of others' minds. There are also those with previously cultivated training who claim to have never practiced anything. It's just a question of time to see if their approaches and teachings will lead to sustainably realized, behaviorally transformed followers. There is also a subtle or perhaps overt form of what I will loosely term arrogance on the part of some teachers who now teach from some impressively high perspective just to highlight what they have attained. And even though the perspective they are currently teaching from wasn't one that would have remotely helped them when they were coming up in their practice. However, as this new way of perceiving reality is now at the forefront of their experiencing, it is very compelling and fascinating. Never underestimate the mind's ability to grip tightly the fruits of practice and cause serious trouble with them. If such individuals could go back in time to when they first started practicing and ask themselves what their current perspective was, would it do them any good? Would they themselves have gotten the insights they currently have following the totally different advice they now dispense? I suspect not, though the experiment can't be done. Regardless, be skeptical of those who advocate a completely different path from the one that got them their current insights. Those who followed a hard, strict, technique-heavy, disciplined path, who now disavow and or advocate no path, are, in my view, missing something crucial about causality. Further, even for those who do teach the practices that work for them, it takes personal discipline and deepening empathy on the part of the teacher to keep remembering that while they may have repeated the basic foundational concepts hundreds of times, they may not have repeated them to you. For those who teach a lot, a certain amount of burnout can set in, and this can cause them to forget to keep presenting things in a logical, straightforward, and complete way, and to do this for meditator after meditator, Dharma talk after Dharma talk, retreat after retreat, year after year. Imagine making a professor of a high-level calculus go back and teach kindergartners to count. Some can do this well, but plenty can't. This is normal human behavior, however disappointing. This raises another apparent paradox. Teachers who are closer to where you are on the path might sometimes make better teachers for you. If they just recently mastered what you are trying to master, just dealt with whatever you are dealing with, their easy recollection of familiar challenges may be more helpful to you than the perspective of someone who hasn't had to personally deal with those challenges in a long time. While teachers who are far along the path often can be very inspiring, that doesn't mean that the people sitting on the cushions beside their main teacher might not actually provide us more timely and relevant advice. As the practices of those in teaching roles develop and change, they may go off in very different directions than the ones we expect or desire. The common scenario is that from their point of view, they may stand to gain from another tradition and so shift in the direction of those practices and perhaps in the direction of their related concepts, terms, and even their traditional contexts and approaches. While we, from our vantage point, still think that what would serve us best is for them to stay interested in the teachings or practices for which we came to appreciate them. This can cause a lot of confusion and resentment in those who don't appreciate the fact that we each are developing our minds and our hearts to fit with our visions of what we think is possible and skillful. And this applies equally to people we think of as Dharma teachers or Dharma friends. Similarly, it is not that uncommon these days for teachers, mentors, or role models to declare that some previous thing that they believed and spoke of with such certainty no longer feels to be completely or even partially true, be it something on the nature of reality, practice, or their own attainments. Predictably, this too can cause much confusion, judgment, anger, and resentment. The dilemma faced by mature and advanced practitioners who understand and are sympathetic to the fact that this can cause a lot of confusion is how to respond to this situation. All too often, the people who have changed some view based on further advancement in their own practice simply keep quiet about it, skip over it, or even repeat things they no longer believe to avoid the chaos that can ensue, or because they believe these falsehoods will still yet provide some benefit to practitioners at earlier stages. This is generally a bad sign, a sign that they have too heavily bought into the role of being some fixed authority who must stick to their story regardless of their changing paradigm or perspective. In communities where it is not known that some of this is to be expected in teachers who are still practicing, the rewards for sweeping such issues under the rug can seem to that teacher to outweigh the rewards of being straightforward and open about what is going on with the teacher. This temptation can be hard to resist. It takes a lot of courage to say that we were wrong, that understanding was only partially developed, or that we are changing our mind. I hope that more mature meditation communities will develop an acceptance that some of this is a positive sign of people's development and growth, rather than some vile inconsistency that must be demonized and punished. This point will apply even more once we start talking about various levels of attainment, many of which are easy to overestimate when they first arise. Some of my Dharma friends and I have a concept we call the funnel. A funnel has a wide end and a narrow end. The wide end symbolizes Dharma that is easily accessible to a large group of people, or Dharma for mass consumption, if you will. The other end is narrow, symbolizing Dharma that is not accessible to the masses, as it is advanced, technical, subtle, and potentially very confusing, alienating, or perhaps even dangerous for anyone who has not progressed or matured enough in practice. There's also the middle of the funnel, which is somewhere in between. Teachers tend to have an area of the funnel that they resonate with best, which they teach most skillfully and naturally. You would think that the part of the funnel that they are most suited to teaching might be a mark of where they are in their own development, but this is not necessarily the case. I've known very advanced teachers who were better at teaching students in the whole or in the wide or middle part than the narrow, though it is true that to teach to the narrow end, you must be an extremely well-developed and integrated practitioner and individual. I have known teachers who were great at teaching the narrow end, but ill-suited to the wide end, though not all of them knew this. I know a few teachers who excel at teaching people in all parts of the funnel. It is not always obvious to which part of the funnel a teacher is teaching. I had a teacher who liked to read The Frog and Toad children's books during her Dharma talks. Her style would have seemed about as wide-ended as it gets. Yet the gently spoken and simple words she spoke had great profundity on many levels, and some points she made would only make sense to me years down the road and much farther along my path. As Kenneth points out, there is room in the meditative ecosystem for teachers in all parts of the funnel. As you practice, you will likely move from the wide end to the narrow end. And as you move, you may need to draw on the support of different teachers and communities who are more suited to where you find yourself. We need kindergarten teachers as much as we need graduate school teachers, as well as all teachers in the grades in between. We also wouldn't necessarily expect graduate school professors to do a good job teaching kindergarten and vice versa, though some do both well. I am implying no hierarchy with this funnel model, just pointing out the general issues so that you may better understand how to interact with teachers. While all this advice on practices and teachers may seem a bit overwhelming, I recommend continuously reconnecting with the basics, the essentials, the simple practices of the spiritual life as it is these which I have come to appreciate as often being the most profoundly transformative. It is your practice that will help you in the end. Here is reality. Here you are. Inhabit this moment and engage with it directly. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is called Daily Life and Retreats. And we'll start up with that tomorrow when we come back. So come back and check it out. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in today and have a great day.